Emilia Adams stood nervously at the gate of Royal Springs Academy, a prestigious school that everyone in Lagos knew about. The towering gates made her feel small, almost like she didn't belong there. Her old school had been simple, the kind of place where students wore second-hand uniforms and shared textbooks. But Royal Springs Academy was different. It was where the children of the rich and powerful went, with shiny new shoes, expensive gadgets, and designer bags. She still couldn't believe she had won a scholarship to this place. Her parents were proud of her, and they had celebrated the news like it was a miracle. But now that she was here, standing in front of this enormous school, Emilia felt the weight of it all. She didn't belong, not really. The other students passed by her, laughing in groups, walking like they owned the world. Emilia clutched the strap of her old, worn-out bag and walked towards the main building. She could feel their eyes on her, probably noticing her plain uniform and scuffed shoes. But she tried not to think about it. She was here to learn, not to impress anyone. She found her classroom after a bit of wandering. When she stepped inside, she saw students chatting loudly, not paying attention to her entrance. She quietly slipped into an empty seat at the back, hoping not to attract any attention. The teacher soon arrived, and the lesson began. But it was hard to focus. Emilia kept feeling like an outsider. The other students barely noticed her, but the air around them screamed wealth and confidence. She felt like she was drowning in it. Her mind drifted, and she found herself thinking about how much things had changed so quickly. During the lunch break, Emilia sat alone at a corner table in the large cafeteria. The room was filled with laughter and chatter, but she wasn't part of any of it. She picked at her food, lost in her thoughts. "Hi, can I sit here?" Emilia looked up, surprised. A girl stood in front of her, holding a tray of food. She had a kind smile and curly hair that framed her face. She looked different from the other students, less intimidating, more approachable. "Sure," Emilia said, relieved to have company. The girl sat down and introduced herself. "I'm Rachel. I just moved here from Kenya." Emilia smiled. "I'm Emilia. It's nice to meet you." They quickly fell into easy conversation. Rachel told her about how hard it had been moving to Nigeria and adjusting to a new school. Emilia understood the feeling of being out of place all too well. It didn't take long for them to bond over how awkward it was to fit into a school full of rich kids when neither of them came from that kind of background. As they talked, Rachel leaned closer and asked in a lower voice, "Have you heard about the red card clique?" Emilia frowned. "No. Who are they?" Rachel glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "They're a group of 4 boys here. They're rich, powerful, and practically run this school. Everyone's scared of them." "Why?" Emilia asked, feeling a sudden chill. "They have this thing," Rachel explained. "If they don't like you, or if you do something they don't approve of, they put a red card in your locker. And once you get a red card, the whole school turns against you. They make your life miserable." Emilia's stomach turned. "That's horrible. Why doesn't anyone stop them?" Rachel sighed. "Because their families are the wealthiest in Lagos. David Johnson, the leader, his family donates millions to this school. The administration turns a blind eye to whatever they do. His father owns one of the largest companies in the city, and his mother is a famous lawyer. The other boys, Richard Okoye, John Adeyemi, and Michael Eze, they're all just as rich. Their families practically own this school." Emilia's heart sank. She had come here hoping for a fresh start, to focus on her studies and make her parents proud. But it sounded like this place was a playground for the rich and powerful, where money ruled everything. "So, they can do whatever they want because their parents pay for it?" Emilia asked, disgusted by the idea. "Pretty much," Rachel said. "Everyone knows that if you mess with them, you'll end up with a red card. And once you get a red card, your life here is over." Emilia didn't know what to say. She had thought Royal Springs Academy would be a place where she could shine through hard work and dedication. But it sounded like surviving here meant staying out of the way of the red card clique. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and the 2 girls headed to their next class. But as Emilia walked down the polished hallways of Royal Springs Academy, A knot formed in her stomach. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. If the red card clique ruled this school, she would have to tread carefully. The next morning, Amelia arrived at school early, hoping to settle in before the day's madness began. She wasn't quite ready to face the cold stares and whispers from students who didn't think she belonged. She walked quickly down the hallway, keeping her head low, trying to blend into the background. As she reached her locker, she noticed a large group of students gathered down the hall, surrounding one of the lockers. The crowd seemed excited, buzzing with curiosity and whispers. Amelia couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. "Another red card," someone muttered nearby. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She remembered what Rachel had told her about the red card clique, a group of rich, powerful boys who ran the school. She hadn't seen them in action yet, but she knew enough to understand that getting a red card meant trouble. Curious but nervous, she walked a bit closer to the crowd, just enough to get a better look. A boy stood frozen in front of his locker, holding a red card in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. The crowd parted, and suddenly 4 boys appeared. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need an introduction to know who they were. The red card clique had arrived. David Johnson led the group, walking with the kind of confidence that only came from knowing you were untouchable. His tall frame and sharp features made him look even more intimidating. The air around him seemed to change as he approached the boy with the red card. Behind him were Richard Okoye, John Adeyemi, and Michael Eza, all watching with smug expressions. David stopped in front of the boy, who was trembling now. The crowd grew silent, waiting for what would happen next. "You know what this means, right?" David said, his voice calm but filled with authority. The boy nodded shakily, his eyes darting around as if searching for help that wouldn't come. David smirked. "Good. Let's go." Without another word, the red card clique turned and began walking down the hallway, the boy following behind like a prisoner being led to his fate. The crowd, eager to see what would happen, trailed after them. Amelia found herself being pushed along with the rest of the students. She didn't want to watch, but something inside her needed to know what this group was capable of. She had to understand the kind of power they held over everyone at the school. The group made their way to the school's old, abandoned sports stadium. It was a place most students avoided, but it had become the unofficial gathering spot for the red card clique whenever they wanted to deliver their brand of justice. Amelia hung back, standing at the edge of the crowd. From her vantage point, she could see David leading the boy to the center of the stadium, where he stopped and turned to face him. "So," David began, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "what made you think you could break the rules?" The boy stammered, trying to explain himself, but David cut him off with a wave of his hand. "It doesn't matter. You broke the rules, and now you have to face the consequences." Amelia watched as the other 3 members of the red card clique circled around the boy, their expressions smug and amused. John and Michael laughed quietly, clearly enjoying the spectacle. But something about Richard caught Amelia's attention. He wasn't laughing. In fact, he looked uncomfortable, almost like he didn't want to be there. As the others taunted the boy, Richard stood a little apart, his eyes occasionally flicking away from the scene, as if he couldn't bear to watch. Without thinking, Amelia moved a little closer, just enough to get a better view of Richard. And then it happened. He turned, caught her eye, and for a brief moment their gazes locked. Amelia froze, her heart racing. In that split second, she saw something in his eyes. Regret, maybe even guilt. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it was gone. Richard turned away, his face hardening again. David took a step forward, towering over the boy in front of him. "Next time, think twice before you mess with us." And with that, David shoved the boy to the ground. The crowd erupted into murmurs and whispers. Some of the students laughed, while others looked on in shock. Amelia's stomach churned. This wasn't just bullying. It was something worse. This was about power, about control. And it was clear that David and his friends held all the cards. When the trial was over, the crowd began to disperse, chatting excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Amelia stayed back, watching as David and the others left the stadium, laughing and high-fiving each other like it had been some kind of game. As she turned to leave, she felt a hand on her arm. She spun around to see Rachel, looking worried. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked. That was intense. Amelia nodded slowly, though she didn't feel okay. "Yeah, I'm fine. But what they did, that was horrible." Rachel sighed. "That's what they do. No one dares to stand up to them because they're too powerful. Their families have too much influence. If the school tried to stop them, they'd lose all their funding." Amelia shook her head, anger bubbling up inside her. "It's not right. Someone has to do something." Rachel gave her a sympathetic look. "I know, but we're just two ordinary girls. What can we do against the most powerful students in the school?" Amelia knew Rachel was right. The red card clique had too much money and too much influence. But as she walked back to class, one thing was clear. She couldn't just sit back and let them get away with this. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Her life at Royal Springs Academy was about to get a lot more complicated. The following day, Amelia was still shaken from her conversation with Rachel about the red card clique, but she tried to push the thought out of her mind. She reminded herself that if she kept her head down, maybe she could avoid trouble. After all, she had only been at Royal Springs Academy for a short while and wanted to focus on her studies. But that day in the cafeteria, things took a turn she hadn't expected. Amelia and Rachel sat together at their usual table, chatting quietly. The lunch hour was its usual mix of loud conversations and clattering trays. Rachel, always a bit clumsy when she was nervous, was trying to eat without making a mess. As Amelia reached for her drink, Rachel's tray suddenly slipped from her hands. In a horrifying instant, a bowl of soup spilled right onto the shoes of someone walking by. The entire cafeteria seemed to freeze as Rachel's eyes widened in horror. And then Amelia saw who it was. David Johnson. The leader of the red card clique stood there, glaring down at his expensive, polished shoes, now drenched in soup. His face, which was usually twisted into an arrogant smirk, was cold and unforgiving. The students around them stopped eating and began to whisper. Rachel's face turned pale as she jumped to her feet, grabbing napkins frantically to clean up the mess. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her hands shaking. "It was an accident." David didn't move. He didn't look at the soup or at the napkins Rachel was offering. He only looked at her, his expression growing darker with every passing second. The cafeteria grew even quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for David's next move. David finally spoke, his voice low and dripping with menace. "Do you know how much these shoes cost?" Rachel's lips quivered. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up. I didn't mean to." David raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't bother with the napkins," he said, his eyes narrowing. "There's a better way to make it up to me." Rachel froze, her hands still clutching the napkins, her eyes wide with fear. Amelia could see the panic in her friend's face, and it made her stomach turn. "Lick it off," David said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His smirk returned, cruel and full of satisfaction. "If you're really sorry, get on your knees and lick it off." A wave of gasps swept through the cafeteria. Some students whispered in shock, while others giggled, treating the scene like some kind of twisted entertainment. The whispers grew louder as everyone waited to see what Rachel would do. Rachel's face turned bright red. She looked like she was about to burst into tears. The students around her started to laugh, enjoying the spectacle, but Amelia felt a surge of anger build inside her. It was one thing to hear about the red card clique's cruelty, but seeing it happen right in front of her was unbearable. "Go on," David taunted, his smirk widening as he looked down at Rachel. "Lick it off if you really want to make up for it." Rachel stood frozen, her body trembling. Amelia's heart pounded as she watched her friend, helpless and humiliated, under the cruel gaze of David and the cheering students. That's when Amelia couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, she shot to her feet, knocking her chair back. The sound echoed across the cafeteria, and everyone turned to look at her. Amelia's heart was racing, but she couldn't stand by and watch this happen. "That's enough," Amelia shouted, her voice cutting through the crowd. David's head snapped toward her, his smirk faltering for a moment as he took in Amelia's defiant stance. He hadn't expected anyone to interrupt. The entire cafeteria fell silent again. All eyes were now on Amelia, and she could feel the weight of their stares, but she wasn't backing down. "Leave her alone," Amelia said, stepping in front of Rachel. Her voice shook, but she refused to let it show. She apologized. It was an accident. David raised an eyebrow, his smirk slowly returning. "Oh, look at this. The scholarship girl wants to be a hero." The students around them began to murmur again, some amused by the confrontation, while others looked anxious, knowing how dangerous it was to challenge the red card clique. Amelia felt her hands trembling, but she stood her ground. "You don't need to humiliate her like this. It's wrong." David took a step closer to her, towering over her with a look of superiority. "And who are you to tell me what's right or wrong?" Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew David held all the power here. His family's wealth, his influence over the school, and his control over the students. But she couldn't back down now, not when Rachel was about to be humiliated in front of everyone. "I'm someone who's not afraid of you," Amelia said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "This isn't how you treat people. You can't just do whatever you want because you're rich." The cafeteria went completely still. Students watched in awe, stunned that someone had dared to talk back to David. David's smirk twisted into something darker. He took another step forward, his eyes locking with Amelia's. "You're brave," he said quietly, "but you don't know who you're messing with." Amelia didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are, and I'm not scared of you." For a moment, David seemed taken aback by her defiance. His smirk wavered, and Amelia saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe frustration. But he quickly masked it with a laugh. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," David said, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "But you should really learn to keep quiet." He turned to Rachel, who was still standing frozen behind Amelia. "You're lucky she stepped in for you," David said, his smirk returning. "But next time you won't get off so easily." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, Richard, John, and Michael following close behind. The students around them slowly resumed their conversations, though many continued to glance at Amelia and Rachel, whispering about what had just happened. Rachel let out a shaky breath, her face still pale. "Thank you, Amelia," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do." Amelia gave her a small smile, though her heart was still racing. "I couldn't just let him treat you like that." But even as she said the words, a cold feeling settled in her stomach. David might have walked away, but Amelia knew this wasn't the end. She had just made herself a target, and in a school where money and power ruled everything, standing up to the red card clique came with consequences. She just didn't know how bad they would be. The cafeteria incident seemed to pass quickly for most of the students at Royal Springs Academy, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The look David had given her before walking away stuck with her, and she knew things would get more complicated from there. She tried to put it out of her mind, focusing on her classes and staying close to Rachel. But the next day, as she walked to her locker before the first bell rang, a sinking feeling hit her. The hallway felt unusually quiet, as if the students were waiting for something to happen. Amelia brushed it off, thinking it was just her nerves getting the best of her after what had happened in the cafeteria. When she reached her locker, her heart stopped. There, tucked neatly between the vents of the metal door, was a small, bright red card. The same kind of card she had seen just days ago. A red card. For a moment, Amelia just stared at it, unable to move. Her worst fear had come true. She was the next target of the red card clique. The card seemed to mock her, bright against the dull grey of the locker. Slowly, with shaky hands, she reached up and pulled it free. It was light, but it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her fingers. All around her, the students had stopped what they were doing. She could feel their eyes on her, whispering, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. It felt like the walls were closing in. "Look, she got a red card. She's next." The words echoed in her head, but she couldn't focus on them. Her mind raced. Why? Why had she been chosen? Was it because she had stood up to David in the cafeteria? Was it some kind of punishment for defending Rachel? Suddenly, a hand touched her arm. Amelia jumped, turning to see Rachel standing beside her, her face filled with concern. "Oh no, Amelia," Rachel whispered, looking at the red card in Amelia's hand. "They gave you one too." Amelia nodded, still in shock. She had known that standing up to David could have consequences, but she hadn't thought it would happen so soon, or be this public. "Just ignore them," Rachel said quickly, glancing nervously at the students gathering nearby. "They're trying to scare you." Amelia swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can." "You have to," Rachel urged, her voice low and anxious. "If you show them you're scared, they'll keep pushing. You have to be strong." The crowd of students continued to grow, murmuring amongst themselves, eyes glued to the red card in Amelia's hand. Some were amused, others looked genuinely concerned, but none of them stepped forward to help. It was as if receiving a red card had marked Amelia as different, an outsider. The students around her were acting like she was cursed, like just being near her would drag them into trouble too. Amelia felt the panic rising in her chest. She had to get out of there. Without saying a word, she shoved the red card into her pocket, slammed her locker shut and hurried down the hallway, pushing past the staring students. She didn't stop until she reached the rooftop, the only place in the school where she could breathe. It was quiet, away from the prying eyes of the students and the suffocating tension of the hallways. Once she was alone, Amelia pulled the red card out of her pocket and stared at it again. It was just a piece of paper, but the weight of what it represented was almost unbearable. She knew what came next. The bullying, the harassment, the isolation. She had seen it happen to others who had been targeted by the red card clique, and now it was her turn. She clenched the card in her fist, anger bubbling up inside her. Why was this happening? All she had done was stand up for Rachel. All she had done was refuse to let David humiliate her friend. And now, she was paying the price. A wave of frustration washed over her, and before she could stop herself, Amelia screamed. She screamed until her throat burned, until all the fear and anger inside her spilled out into the open air. Suddenly, the door to the rooftop creaked open. Amelia froze, turning to see who had heard her outburst. It was Richard, one of the members of the notorious group. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching her. His face was unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that Amelia hadn't seen before. "You're not handling this very well," he said quietly, stepping onto the rooftop and closing the door behind him. Amelia wiped at her eyes, trying to steady her voice. "What do you care?" Richard walked closer, stopping a few feet away from her. "You shouldn't let them see you like this. If they know you're scared, it'll only get worse." Amelia glared at him, still clutching the red card in her hand. "You're one of them, Richard. Why should I listen to you? You're part of the reason I'm in this mess." Richard didn't respond right away. He looked out at the skyline, his expression distant. "You're right. I am part of it. But that doesn't mean I agree with everything David does." Amelia stared at him, unsure of what to say. Richard had always seemed different from the others in the red card clique, but she had never really known why. Now, here he was, talking to her like he actually cared about what happened. "So why don't you stop him?" Amelia asked, her voice full of frustration. "If you don't agree with what he's doing, why do you just stand by and watch?" Richard sighed. "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" Amelia shot back. "You're just as guilty as he is. You're letting it happen." Richard's face tightened, and for a moment Amelia thought he might leave. But instead he stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "Look, I can't stop David. He's complicated. But I'm telling you, if you want to survive here, you have to keep your head down. Don't provoke him. Don't give him a reason to come after you harder." Amelia looked at him, anger still simmering inside her. She couldn't understand why someone like Richard, who seemed to have a conscience, would stay silent and let the red card clique continue their reign of terror. But his words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. "What do I do now?" Amelia asked, her voice softer, the fear creeping back in. Richard hesitated, then glanced at the crumpled red card in her hand. Just don't let him see you break. Whatever happens, don't let them think they've won. With that, Richard turned and walked back to the door, leaving Amelia alone once again. But his words echoed in her mind long after he was gone. Don't let them see you break. Amelia knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't hide from what was coming. She had to face it head on, even if the red card click made her life a living nightmare. The days following that were a nightmare for Amelia. The harassment had become unbearable. Everywhere Amelia went, the weight of the red card followed her like a dark shadow. Each day brought new cruelty, whether it was notes slipped into her locker with cruel messages, or students bumping into her in the hallways, sneering and whispering behind her back. But today was different. Today they had crossed a line. Amelia had returned to her locker after gym class, exhausted and hoping to just get through the rest of the day. But when she opened the door, her heart stopped. Her shoes, the pair her mother had given her as a gift, were missing. They were her favorite shoes. Simple but beautiful. Something that reminded her of home and her parents' pride when she had earned her scholarship. Frantic, she searched her locker, hoping they had just fallen to the back or been misplaced. But deep down, she knew what had happened. She looked around the hallway, her chest tightening with dread. The students passing by smirked, their faces full of knowing glances, but no one said a word. Amelia's heart pounded as she felt a sinking realization wash over her. The red card click had taken them. Her hands trembled as she hurried out of the school building, her mind racing. There was only one place they would be, the old stadium. It was the spot where the red card click liked to deal out their cruel punishments, and if her shoes were there, she knew what she would find. She arrived at the abandoned stadium, her feet dragging as she approached the entrance. It was eerily quiet, but as she stepped inside, she heard faint laughter. There, standing in the middle of the stadium, were David, Richard, John, and Michael. They were gathered around something, and Amelia's stomach twisted when she realized what it was. Her shoes. David stood at the center of the group, holding one of her shoes in his hand. His face was twisted into that familiar, cruel smirk as he waved the shoe around, clearly enjoying the power he held. Amelia's heart sank as she saw the other shoe on the ground, its delicate fabric slashed open with a knife. They had destroyed them. Amelia's vision blurred with tears as she stepped forward. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. David turned slowly, his smirk widening when he saw her. "Oh, look who decided to join us," he said, his voice mocking. "You didn't think you could get away without paying the price, did you?" Amelia's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the ruined shoes. They had meant everything to her. More than just a pair of shoes, they were a reminder of her family's love, of how hard she had worked to get to this school. And now, they were ruined. "You had no right," Amelia said, her voice shaking but filled with fury. "Those were mine. They were a gift from my mother." David laughed, tossing the damaged shoe into the dirt. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to challenge me." Richard, standing a little behind David, looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. John and Michael just watched with amused expressions, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Amelia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel her whole body trembling with anger and grief. This was too much. They had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to stand by and let them do this. David took a step closer, his smile smug. "What's the matter, Amelia? Upset that your little shoes got ruined?" That was it. That was the final straw. Without thinking, Amelia lunged at David. The anger that had been building inside her for days, weeks, finally exploded. She wasn't going to let him humiliate her any longer. David, clearly not expecting her reaction, stumbled back as she shoved him with all her strength. The other boys looked shocked as Amelia closed the gap between them, her fury driving her forward. "You don't get to treat people like this," she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. David, regaining his balance, glared at her, his smug smile gone. "You're making a big mistake," he growled, taking a step forward as if to intimidate her. But Amelia wasn't backing down, not this time. Her heart pounding in her chest, she bent down and grabbed her damaged shoes from the dirt. Her eyes locked on David's, and before he could react, Amelia swung her leg back and kicked him hard with the ruined shoe. The force of the kick knocked him off balance and he stumbled back, falling to the ground. The stadium went silent. The other members of the red card clique stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock. No one had ever stood up to David like this, and certainly no one had ever fought back so directly. Amelia stood over David, her body shaking, her heart racing. The damaged shoe hung loosely in her hand, but she didn't care about the tears rolling down her cheeks. Her voice was strong as she looked down at him and said, "I'm done being your victim. Do you hear me? I'm not afraid of you." David stared up at her, speechless. For the first time, he wasn't smirking. He wasn't laughing. He looked genuinely stunned. Amelia turned and stormed out of the stadium, clutching her ruined shoes in her hands. She felt a sense of relief, a sense of freedom. She had stood up to David. She had fought back. And even though she knew this wasn't the end, she wasn't going to let him break her. As she left the stadium, Amelia couldn't help thinking that something had changed. David had seen her strength, and though he was shocked now, she could tell that her defiance had caught his attention in a way she hadn't expected. And that terrified her just as much as it empowered her. The next day, the atmosphere at Royal Springs Academy was different. Amelia could feel it the moment she stepped through the gates. Whispers followed her everywhere, but unlike before, they weren't just whispers of mockery. There was something else in the air now, something like respect, or at least a grudging acknowledgement of her defiance. Word had spread quickly about what had happened in the old stadium. Everyone knew that she had kicked David, the untouchable leader of the red card clique, and walked away. And while most of the students still kept their distance from her, afraid of drawing David's wrath, there were a few glances of admiration in the crowd. But Amelia wasn't concerned with their opinions. She was still angry about her shoes, angry about the way David and his friends ruled the school, and angry that no one else had the courage to stand up to them. She had made her stand, but she knew this was far from over. David Johnson wasn't the kind of person to let things go. As the school day dragged on, Amelia kept her head down, focusing on her work. But during lunch, as she was walking to the cafeteria, she saw David leaning against the wall near the entrance. His arms were crossed, and he was staring at her with that familiar smirk. But something was different this time. There was no crowd around him, no entourage. It was just him. "Amelia?" he called out as she tried to walk past him. She didn't stop, but David quickly caught up to her, falling into step beside her. "You're a hard person to ignore these days." Amelia shot him a glance, her stomach twisting. She didn't want to deal with him, not after everything that had happened. "What do you want, David?" He smiled, his eyes studying her face carefully. "You're a lot tougher than I gave you credit for. Most people would have backed down by now." Amelia rolled her eyes and kept walking. "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing." David chuckled, not bothered by her cold response. "No games, Amelia. I just think we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't you come over to my place later? We can talk, sort things out." Amelia stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why would I want to do that?" David's smile didn't falter, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "Because this whole thing between us doesn't have to keep going. You apologize, I forgive you, and things can go back to normal. Simple." Amelia's anger flared up again. "Apologize? For what? For standing up to you? For not letting you and your friends ruin my life?" David's smirk faded slightly. "For making a scene. For kicking me in front of the whole school. You know how this works, Amelia. Just admit you were wrong, and we can both move on." Amelia glared at him. "I wasn't wrong, David. You were. And I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself." David's eyes narrowed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Amelia could see the frustration building in him. But she didn't care. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her into backing down. Finally, David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right. Come to my house tonight. We'll talk. No strings attached." Amelia hesitated. She didn't trust him, but there was something in his tone that made her curious. Why was he so determined to get her to his house? What did he really want? "Fine," she said, her voice firm. "I'll come, but don't think for a second that I'm going to apologize." David smirked again, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. "We'll see." Later that evening, Amelia found herself standing outside the massive gates of the Johnson estate. It was just as intimidating as she had imagined. Tall iron gates, perfectly manicured lawns, and a mansion that looked more like a palace. This was the kind of wealth David had grown up with, the kind of power that made him think he could control everyone around him. The gates opened silently, and Amelia walked up the long driveway, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to expect, but she wasn't going to let David intimidate her. Not here. Not anywhere. David was waiting for her at the front door, leaning casually against the frame. He smiled as she approached, but it wasn't the same arrogant smirk he usually wore. This smile seemed different. "Glad you could make it," he said, stepping aside to let her in. Amelia didn't respond. She stepped into the grand entryway, her eyes scanning the luxurious surroundings. The place was huge, with marble floors, high ceilings, and expensive art on the walls. It felt cold, sterile, like the kind of place where emotions had no place. David led her into a large sitting room with tall windows and plush sofas. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the couches. Amelia sat down, her posture stiff. She wasn't here to relax. She was here to figure out what David really wanted. "So," David began, sitting across from her, "we could keep fighting, but honestly, I don't think it's worth it. You're different from the other students here, Amelia. I can see that." Amelia frowned, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" David leaned back, watching her closely. "Most people in this school just follow the rules. They don't push back. But you don't care about the rules, do you?" "I care about what's right," Amelia said, her voice firm. "I'm not going to let you bully me just because you think you can." David's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. "That's exactly why I'm interested in you, Amelia. You're not like the others." Amelia shifted uncomfortably. "What do you want from me, David?" David hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I want you to apologize. Not because I need it, but because it's what's best for you. You don't know what my family is capable of, and trust me, it's better to be on my good side." Amelia's stomach turned. She had known there was something more to this invitation. So this was never about making peace. "You just want me to bow down like everyone else." David didn't deny it. "This is how things work here. You either get in line, or you get crushed." Amelia's anger flared up again, but before she could respond, the door to the room swung open. A tall, elegant woman stepped into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her presence was commanding, and Amelia immediately knew who she was. Rosalind Johnson, David's mother. Rosalind's gaze swept over Amelia, then shifted to David. "What's going on here, David?" David straightened up, his confident demeanor faltering slightly. "We're just talking, Mom." Rosalind's eyes narrowed. "I hope you're not wasting your time with foolishness. We have important matters to discuss. You know your place in this family." Amelia watched the exchange, surprised by how easily David seemed to shrink under his mother's gaze. For someone who always acted like he was in control, it was clear that Rosalind was the real power behind the scenes. "I'm not wasting my time," David muttered, glancing at Amelia. Rosalind's sharp eyes turned to Amelia. "And you're the one causing my son trouble, aren't you?" Amelia felt a chill run down her spine, but she met Rosalind's gaze with defiance. "I'm not causing trouble. I'm standing up for myself." Rosalind studied her for a moment, then smiled coldly. "You're a bold one, aren't you? But let me make one thing clear. My son has responsibilities, and I won't let anyone get in the way of that, and not even you." Amelia's heart raced, but she refused to let Rosalind intimidate her. "I'm not afraid of you." Rosalind's smile didn't falter. "You should be." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and Amelia knew that whatever happened next, things were about to get even more complicated. Amelia's defiance had set something into motion, something she couldn't fully understand yet. After her visit to the Johnson house and the chilling confrontation with David's mother, Rosalind, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Rosalind's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, Amelia started to see David differently. He wasn't just some spoiled bully. He was also someone living under the crushing expectations of his powerful family. But that didn't make him any less dangerous. The next day at school, it was clear that David hadn't taken her rejection well. In fact, he seemed more determined than ever to make her pay for standing up to him. The harassment intensified. Amelia found her textbooks vandalized, her locker filled with garbage, and cruel messages written on her desk in red marker. No matter where she went, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. The red card clique wasn't just targeting her anymore. They were trying to break her spirit completely. During lunch, Amelia sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, avoiding the usual spots where she might run into David and his friends. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The constant bullying, the isolation, it was wearing her down. She had always been strong, but even she had limits. As she picked at her food, she saw David walk into the cafeteria with Richard, John, and Michael trailing behind him. His eyes locked onto hers immediately, and that familiar, unsettling smirk spread across his face. But there was something different in his expression now, something she hadn't seen before. He wasn't just angry, he was intrigued. David made his way over to her table, his friends hanging back as if waiting for instructions. The entire cafeteria fell silent as David sat down across from Amelia, casually resting his arm on the back of the chair like this was a normal conversation. "You've been causing a lot of trouble, Amelia," he said, his voice smooth but laced with a dangerous edge. Amelia didn't look up from her tray. "I'm just trying to survive." David chuckled softly. "You think you're surviving, but I think you're forgetting how this school works. People don't defy me." Amelia finally met his gaze, her eyes full of fire. "Maybe they should." David's smile faltered for a second, and in that moment, Amelia saw something flicker in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. It was a look she hadn't expected from him, and it unsettled her more than his threats ever had. "I don't get you," David said, leaning in slightly. "Most people in your position would have crumbled by now. But you're still standing." Amelia clenched her jaw. "Maybe that's because I don't care about what you think." David raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her defiance. "You're a tough one, Amelia. I'll give you that." For a moment there was silence between them, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Amelia could feel the eyes of the entire cafeteria on them, but she refused to look away from David. Just as she was about to stand up and leave, Richard walked over, his expression tense. "David, let's go," he said quietly. "This is getting out of hand." David glanced up at Richard, his smirk returning. "What's the matter, Richard? Getting soft?" Richard didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "This isn't what we signed up for." David stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing at Richard. "Oh, really? Then what do you think we signed up for, Richard?" The cafeteria went dead silent. Amelia watched as the tension between David and Richard grew, the air thick with unspoken words. It was the first time she had seen any of David's friends challenge him so directly, and it was clear that Richard wasn't backing down. Richard's gaze shifted to Amelia for a moment before turning back to David. "You're taking this too far," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What are we even trying to prove anymore?" David's eyes darkened. "We're proving that no one crosses us. That's what this is about." Amelia sat frozen in her seat, watching the exchange. She had always thought Richard was just as bad as the others. But now she wasn't so sure. There was something different about him. Something that made her question whether he really belonged with David and the rest of the clique. "I'm not sure that's the point anymore," Richard muttered, crossing his arms. "Maybe it's time to stop." David's face twisted in frustration. "You've always been the soft one, Richard. If you can't handle this, then maybe you shouldn't be part of the group anymore." It seemed like things might come to blows. But then Richard shook his head, taking a step back. "Whatever, man. Do what you want." David watched him for a moment, his eyes filled with contempt, but he didn't stop Richard as he walked away. Amelia watched as Richard left the cafeteria, feeling a strange sense of relief. She hadn't expected him to stand up to David, but seeing him do it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in this fight. David turned back to Amelia, his expression hardening. "Don't think this is over," he warned, his voice cold. "You might have impressed me, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let you off easy." "I'm not afraid of you, David." David's smirk returned, though there was something more dangerous in it now. "You should be." He turned and walked away, leaving Amelia sitting alone at the table. The cafeteria slowly returned to its usual noise, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. David was intrigued by her. She could see it in his eyes. But that only made things more dangerous. The days following Richard's quiet rebellion against David were tense, and Amelia felt like the weight of the entire school was pressing down on her. The harassment from the red card clique hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. David seemed to be on a mission to break her, but despite everything, she refused to back down. One afternoon, as Amelia made her way through the school hallways, she heard the familiar whispers again. Her stomach churned when she noticed the looks of pity directed not at her, but at Rachel. "Did you hear? She's next," someone muttered as they passed. Amelia's heart sank. She quickened her pace, heading straight for Rachel's locker. When she arrived, her worst fears were confirmed. Rachel was standing there, her face pale, clutching a small red card in her trembling hand. "Rachel?" Amelia whispered, stepping closer. Rachel looked up, her eyes filled with fear. "They gave me a red card, Amelia. They're going to do something horrible, I just know it." Amelia's blood boiled. This was all David's doing, his cruel way of punishing her through Rachel. But she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not again. Later that day, word spread that the red card clique had called for another trial at the old stadium. This time, their target was Rachel. The students whispered among themselves, too afraid to intervene but eager to watch the spectacle. Amelia could feel the anger building inside her as she made her way to the stadium, determined to stop whatever David had planned. When she arrived, the stadium was already filled with students. In the middle of it all stood David, Richard, John, and Michael, with Rachel sitting on a stool in front of them. Her hands trembled as she sat, her eyes darting around the crowd, clearly terrified. In David's hand was a pair of clippers. "We're going to teach her a lesson," David said loudly, addressing the crowd. "One that everyone here will remember." The crowd buzzed with anticipation, but Amelia couldn't stand by any longer. She pushed her way through the students until she reached the center of the group. "Stop!" Amelia shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. David turned, his smirk widening when he saw her. "Ah, there she is, just in time." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "You don't have to do this, David. This isn't punishment, it's cruelty." David chuckled. "Cruelty? No, this is justice. You should have apologized, Amelia. Now Rachel has to pay the price." Amelia's heart raced as she glanced at Rachel, who looked like she was on the verge of tears. She turned back to David, her voice firm. "You're not hurting anyone but yourself with this, David. You think this makes you powerful, but it doesn't. It just makes you a coward." The crowd murmured in surprise at her bold words, and for a brief moment, Amelia thought she saw something flicker in David's eyes. Doubt, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You're brave, Amelia," David said quietly, stepping closer to her. "But you don't understand how this works. This is about control, and I control everything here." Just as David raised the clippers toward Rachel's head, a voice rang out from the edge of the crowd. "Stop!" Richard appeared, pushing his way through the students. His face was tense, his jaw clenched. "David, enough!" David looked at Richard, clearly irritated. "What's your problem, Richard?" "This has gone too far," Richard said, stepping forward. "You don't need to do this." David's eyes darkened. "You're either with us or against us, Richard. Don't forget that." But Richard didn't back down. He looked at Rachel, then at Amelia, and shook his head. "I'm not going to let you humiliate her like this." David glared at Richard, his hand tightening around the clippers, but after a moment of tense silence, he lowered them. The crowd seemed to exhale in unison, the tension dissipating slightly. "Fine," David said coldly, his eyes locking with Amelia's. "But don't think this is over." With that, he tossed the clippers aside and stormed off, followed by John and Michael. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, disappointed that the spectacle hadn't gone as planned. Amelia rushed to Rachel's side, helping her up from the stool. "Are you okay?" Rachel nodded, her face still pale but relieved. "Thank you, Amelia. I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her voice shaking with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," Amelia said softly. "We're in this together." A few days later, the school was buzzing with excitement. Lara Johnson, David's older sister, had returned from her studies abroad, and to celebrate her homecoming, she was throwing a lavish party at the Johnson estate. It was all anyone could talk about. Lara was well known not just because she was David's sister, but because she had her own kind of power. She had always been the queen of the school before she left for university, and now everyone was eager to impress her. To Amelia's surprise, she received an invitation to the party. It was strange. She knew David didn't want her there, but Lara seemed to have included everyone, even those outside the clique. Rachel was excited, urging Amelia to go with her. "Maybe things will be different now that Richard stood up to David. Maybe this party will give you a chance to, I don't know, turn things around." Amelia wasn't so sure, but against her better judgment, she decided to go. If nothing else, she was curious to see what would happen. The Johnson estate was even more intimidating during the party. The sprawling lawns were filled with students from Royal Springs Academy, all dressed in their finest clothes, trying to fit in with the wealthy elite. Music played in the background, and waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks. As soon as Amelia arrived, she felt out of place. She wasn't like the others here. She didn't belong in this world of luxury and privilege. She could see the way some of the students whispered as she passed, mocking her for daring to show up at a party like this. But she stayed, mostly because of Richard. Ever since the incident at the stadium, she couldn't stop thinking about him. He had stood up to David, something no one else had done before, and it had left her confused. Could she really trust him? As the night wore on, Amelia found herself wandering near the pool, trying to escape the crowd. The cool breeze helped calm her nerves, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And then she saw him. David. He was standing on the other side of the pool, watching her intently. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Jealousy? Anger? Amelia couldn't tell. Before she could react, David walked toward her, his expression darkening with every step. "You're spending a lot of time around Richard," he said, his voice low and full of resentment. Amelia frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" David stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I see the way you look at him." Amelia's heart raced, but not out of fear this time. There was something different about the way David was acting tonight, something that made her feel unsettled. "This has nothing to do with Richard," Amelia said, her voice steady. "You're the one who's been cruel. You're the one who's pushing everyone away." David's face twisted with anger. "You think you know me? You don't know anything about me." Before she could respond, someone bumped into them, and in the confusion, Amelia tripped. She stumbled forward, and as she reached out to steady herself, her lips brushed against David's. For a split second, they both froze, their eyes wide with shock. It was an accidental, awkward moment, but the confusion it caused lingered in the air between them. Amelia pulled back quickly, her heart racing. That wasn't..." David stepped back too, looking just as stunned. For the first time, Amelia saw vulnerability in his eyes, a flicker of something human beneath the layers of cruelty. Neither of them spoke as the tension grew thicker, but one thing was clear. Everything had just gotten a lot more complicated. The days following Lara's party were filled with awkward tension for Amelia. The accidental kiss with David left her confused and unsettled. She wasn't sure what it meant or how she felt about it, and David's strange behavior only made things worse. He seemed distant and angry one moment, but then oddly fascinated with her the next. It was a roller coaster of emotions she hadn't expected, especially since her feelings for Richard were already complicated enough. But just as Amelia was trying to make sense of everything, another major shift rocked the school. Richard, one of the key members of the Red Card clique, had been growing more distant over the past few weeks. Amelia had noticed his quiet demeanor and the way he seemed less involved in the clique's activities. His relationship with Lara, David's sister, was the only thing keeping him anchored to the group, and everyone could tell that something was brewing beneath the surface. Then the news broke. Richard and Lara were leaving for Kenya. Lara had been offered an incredible opportunity to continue her studies abroad, and Richard was going with her. The announcement sent shockwaves through the school, especially among the members of the Red Card clique. It was as if the foundation of their group was crumbling. For Amelia, the news hit hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. Richard had always been more reserved than the others, and there was something about him that she had come to admire. His departure, paired with the confusing feelings she had developed for both him and David, left her emotionally conflicted. It didn't help that Richard had become increasingly kind to her. Ever since he had stood up to David, Amelia had started to see him in a different light. But now, with Richard leaving, she wasn't sure where her heart was pulling her. The day after Richard's announcement, things took another unexpected turn. The school was buzzing with gossip about Richard and Lara's departure, and Amelia was doing her best to stay out of the drama. She walked through the hallways, her head down, when she suddenly heard a commotion. Students were gathering in the main courtyard, whispering excitedly. Amelia hesitated, unsure whether to join them, but curiosity got the better of her. She pushed her way through the crowd until she reached the front, where she saw David standing on a raised platform, addressing the gathered students. At first, Amelia thought he was going to make some grand statement about the Red Card clique, something dramatic, as usual. But then, David did something that shocked everyone, especially Amelia. "I have something to say," David announced, his voice clear and confident. The students fell silent, waiting for him to continue. His eyes scanned the crowd, and then, to Amelia's horror, they landed directly on her. "I'm in love with Amelia," David declared loudly. A wave of gasps swept through the crowd. Amelia's heart stopped. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. David Johnson, leader of the Red Card clique, the same person who had bullied her relentlessly, was publicly declaring his love for her. The students erupted into whispers, and Amelia felt their eyes on her. She stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. David stepped down from the platform and walked toward her, his gaze unwavering. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, his voice softer now. "But I don't care about the past anymore. I want everyone to know how I feel." Amelia's mind was racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was David trying to humiliate her again? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. Before she could respond, the crowd around them started murmuring louder, fueling the gossip mill. Some students looked shocked, while others seemed amused by the spectacle. Amelia felt trapped, like all eyes were on her, waiting for her next move. But instead of responding, Amelia turned and hurried out of the courtyard, leaving David and the whispers behind her. The fallout from David's public confession was immediate. The Red Card clique had always operated with a sense of unity, but that was starting to unravel. Richard's impending departure had already weakened the group's cohesion, and David's declaration of love for Amelia had thrown everything into chaos. John and Michael, David's closest allies, were confused and frustrated. They couldn't understand why David would suddenly turn his attention toward Amelia, the very girl they had spent weeks tormenting. They began to question his judgment, and soon, the cracks in their friendship started to show. Richard, too, heard about David's sudden confession from Michael and was caught in the middle. Ever since he had distanced himself from David's cruel actions and decided to leave the country with Lara, he had hoped Emilia would have a peaceful school year as he genuinely cared for her. He didn't trust David's intentions, and he certainly didn't believe that David's sudden affection for Emilia was genuine. The once powerful red card clique was beginning to fall apart. Tensions ran high, and it was only a matter of time before the group turned on each other completely. Amid the chaos, another revelation emerged, one that no one had seen coming. Rachel, who had always seemed like a supportive friend to Emilia, was revealed to have been pulling the strings behind the scenes. For months, she had been manipulating events, using her position within the school's social circles to influence the red card clique's actions. Her ultimate goal had been simple: to win David's love for herself. Rachel had always been in love with David, but she had kept her feelings hidden. She had watched as David became obsessed with Emilia, and she had grown increasingly jealous. In her desperation, she had orchestrated much of the drama that had unfolded between David, Emilia, and the rest of the clique. When her betrayal was revealed, it sent shockwaves through the group. Rachel had been quietly manipulating people, spreading rumors, and fanning the flames of conflict, all to push Emilia out of the picture and win David's heart, while Emilia had done nothing but defend her all along. But her plan had failed. David was furious when he found out, and the remaining members of the clique were left reeling from the discovery. Rachel had betrayed them all, and now, the group that had once ruled the school with an iron fist was collapsing from within. Rachel tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was unraveling. Each day at school became harder for her as whispers followed her through the hallways. No one wanted to be associated with her anymore. Emilia watched from the sidelines as Rachel's world collapsed. Despite everything, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her former friend. It was painful to watch someone who had been so determined to win love through deceit fall so spectacularly. But Emilia also knew that Rachel had brought this on herself. One day, as Emilia was heading out of class, she found Rachel waiting for her near the school gates. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she looked like a shadow of the confident girl she had once been. "Emilia," Rachel said quietly, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for things to go this far." Emilia didn't respond right away. She looked at Rachel, torn between anger and pity. "You hurt a lot of people, Rachel," she finally said. "You tried to tear me down to get what you wanted." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I didn't know how else to make David see me. But now, I've lost everything." Emilia sighed, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. "Rachel, love doesn't come from lies and manipulation. You can't force someone to care about you by hurting others." Rachel nodded, her tears spilling over. "I just wanted to matter to someone." "You can still change," Emilia said softly. "It's not too late." But Rachel just shook her head, the hopelessness clear in her eyes. "I don't think I can," she whispered, before walking away, her figure disappearing into the distance. While Rachel reflected on the wrong she had done, a new threat was looming on the horizon, one that would shake the very foundation of the school. Collins, a student who had been bullied relentlessly by the red card clique in the past, had returned to school after an extended absence. No one had thought much of it at first. He was quiet, keeping to himself, and most people assumed he was just trying to move on from the trauma he had suffered. But Collins had not come back to forgive or forget. He had come back for revenge. Emilia sensed that something was wrong. Collins had been watching her closely for days, and it made her uneasy. She wasn't sure what his plan was, but she could feel that something terrible was about to happen. Then one afternoon, the unthinkable happened. Emilia was on her way to meet Rachel when she suddenly realized she couldn't find her anywhere. Panic set in as she checked the usual spots, but Rachel was nowhere to be found. That's when she received a message, a text from an unknown number. "I've taken her. Meet me at the old stadium. Bring David." Emilia's heart raced. She knew immediately that this was Collins. He had taken Rachel, and now he was demanding a confrontation. Emilia had no choice but to go to David. Emilia found David in the school parking lot, pacing back and forth as if he was waiting for something. When he saw her approach, his expression darkened. "What's going on?" he demanded, sensing the urgency in her step. "Collins," Emilia said breathlessly. "He's taken Rachel. He wants to meet at the old stadium and he's asking for you." David's face went pale for a moment before his expression hardened. Without a word, he grabbed his jacket and started walking toward the stadium, Emilia following close behind. When they arrived at the old stadium, the place was eerily quiet. Collins stood in the center of the field, a menacing grin on his face, with Rachel tied to a chair beside him. She looked terrified, her face streaked with tears. "Let her go, Collins," David shouted, stepping forward. Collins shook his head. "Not yet, David. You and your little red card clique made my life hell. Now it's my turn to take something from you." David's fists clenched, but before he could respond, Emilia stepped forward. "Collins, this isn't the way to make things right," she said softly. "I know what they did to you was wrong, but this won't fix anything." Collins glared at her. "Stay out of this, Emilia. You don't know what it's like to be on the receiving end of their cruelty." Emilia's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "I know more than you think, Collins. But hurting Rachel, hurting David, it won't give you the closure you're looking for." For a moment, Collins seemed to hesitate, but then his gaze hardened once more. "Maybe not, but it'll make me feel better." Just as Collins was about to strike Rachel, David lunged forward, but Collins was faster. He swung a metal pipe toward David, but Emilia, acting on instinct, threw herself in front of him, taking the blow instead. Pain shot through Emilia as she collapsed to the ground, her vision blurring. David caught her, his eyes wide with panic. "Emilia!" Everything around her felt hazy, but through the pain, Emilia could hear David shouting at Collins, telling him to stop. She could feel his arms around her, but the world was slipping away. "David," she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here," David said, his voice trembling. "Stay with me, Emilia." In the chaos that followed, Collins was quickly overpowered and restrained by other students who had arrived at the scene. The police were called, Rachel was rescued and sent home safely, and Collins was taken away, but the damage had already been done. Emilia was rushed to the hospital, her injuries severe but not life-threatening. She had saved David, but in doing so, she had become the final victim in the Red Card clique's long history of cruelty. David, still reeling from the shock of Emilia's injury, sat beside her hospital bed. The lights hummed softly, but nothing could erase the look of guilt and regret on his face. Emilia had taken a blow meant for him, and that realization weighed heavily on his heart. Emilia stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she regained consciousness. The pain in her side was sharp, but seeing David there, his face pale and full of worry, made it easier to bear. "Hey," Emilia whispered, her voice weak but steady. David's head snapped up, relief flooding his expression. "Emilia, thank God," he breathed. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, but he stopped short, unsure of what to say or do. Emilia managed a small smile. "You look like you've seen a ghost." David let out a shaky laugh, though the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. "I thought I almost lost you." There was a pause, the air between them heavy with unsaid words. Emilia knew this wasn't the time for long speeches or deep conversations, but she also knew there was something they both needed to acknowledge. "We have to stop this," Emilia said quietly. "The bullying, the cruelty, it's enough." David nodded, his eyes clouded with regret. "I know. I've been wrong. About everything." For the first time, David seemed vulnerable in a way Emilia hadn't seen before. He wasn't the smug leader of the Red Card clique anymore. He was just a boy who had made mistakes, who had hurt people, and who now understood the damage he had caused. "I'll stop, Emilia," David promised. "The Red Card clique. It's over, I swear." Emilia closed her eyes, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. It was the promise she had been hoping for, the ending she had fought for. But more than that, it was the beginning of something better. A new chapter not just for her, but for the entire school. Over the next few days, The chaos that had consumed Royal Springs Academy began to settle. Collins was expelled from the school for his actions, and the authorities made sure he wouldn't be returning. But amid the aftermath, something unexpected blossomed: Amelia's relationship with David. As Amelia healed, David visited her often. Their conversations shifted from guilt and regret to something softer, something more genuine. He wasn't the David she had known before, the one filled with cruelty and arrogance. He was a different person now, someone who had learned the hard way what it meant to be human, to be flawed. Amelia's heart softened toward him, though she couldn't deny that Richard was still somewhere in her thoughts. His departure with Lara had left a void, but it had also given her the space to figure out what she really wanted. She could feel her love for David brewing really strong, even stronger than her crush on Richard. And what she wanted now was simple: peace. One afternoon, as Amelia sat outside in the hospital garden, enjoying the sunshine, David joined her. He was quiet for a while before he finally spoke. "You know," he said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About you. About us." Amelia glanced at him, curious. "And?" David met her gaze, his expression serious but hopeful. "I don't know where things will go from here, but I want to try. I want to be better, for you, for myself." Amelia smiled, a warmth spreading through her. "I think we can both start over." As the weeks passed, Royal Springs Academy slowly returned to normal, though the school was forever changed by the events that had transpired. The Red Card clique was officially disbanded, and the fear that had once dominated the hallways began to lift. Students walked with their heads held high, no longer afraid of the group that had once ruled with an iron fist. David kept his promise. The bullying stopped, and in its place, something new began to grow: respect. Not just for Amelia, but for everyone who had suffered under the clique's cruelty. David worked hard to make amends, and though it took time, people began to see that he was truly trying to change. Amelia's bravery had inspired more than just David. Other students, once too scared to stand up for themselves, found their voices. They started speaking out against bullying, against cruelty, and slowly but surely the school became a better place. As for Amelia and David, their relationship blossomed, though it wasn't without its challenges. They both knew that healing from the past would take time, but they were willing to work through it, together. Richard, though far away in Kenya with Lara, remained in Amelia's thoughts, but she had made peace with his departure. Their time together had been meaningful, but she knew now that her future was here, with David, and with the new chapter they were building together. The final day of the school year arrived, and the air was filled with excitement and hope. Students gathered for the closing ceremony, and as Amelia stood beside David, watching the crowd, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. They had made it through the storm. They had come out stronger. As the sun set over the school, David turned to Amelia, his hand slipping into hers. "We did it," he whispered. Amelia smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "We did." And as the light faded and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The future was wide open, full of possibility, and this time they would face it together. They had made it through the storm. They had come out stronger. As the sun set over the school, David turned to Amelia, his hand slipping into hers. "We did it," he whispered. Amelia smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "We did." And as the light faded and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The future was wide open, full of possibility, and this time they would face it together.